and director of the
Did we lose Elisa?
Yes, we did.
We'll give her just a few moments. Thanks for holding on with us, folks.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to jump in. I'm not Elisa Munoz, but since she's having some technical difficulties, we're going to get started with our program. I'm Cindi Leive. I'm co-founder of the Meteor, and I'm also a proud board member of the International Women's Media Foundation. So thank you both to the Washington Post and to the IWMF for convening this conversation. And I especially want to shout out the IWMF because they, as an organization, have been such leaders in supporting women journalists and also continuously blowing the whistle on the increasing dangers that women journalists face. We're going to be hearing a lot about that today. So thanks to them for their leadership. I first learned about the extraordinary work of our guest today, Lydia Cacho, 15 years ago. She had just published her book, The Demons of Eden, which exposed a government-supported sex trafficking ring in the lush resort town of Cancun. That was reporting for which the government illegally jailed and tortured her. Like the rest of the world, I marveled at Lydia's courage and her backbone and her determination to speak the truth, often live on TV and at huge personal risk. But Lydia had been doing that for many, many years before that moment. She had been covering acts of violence, both state perpetrated and domestic violence, since the 1990s, and had opened a domestic violence shelter in Cancun as well, work that earned her threats and yes, attacks from her enemies. Since that time, Lydia's critical role as a journalist and a human rights activist has only grown. As she likes to put it, journalism is the way toward justice. She's published a dozen books, most on international sex crimes and trafficking, and she's endured many years of sharp and violent harassment from people who oppose her reporting, which has forced her to flee Mexico. This abuse continues today, and in light of that, we could not be more honored that she has chosen to be here with us from what she describes as her exile. Lydia, welcome.
Thank you, Cindi, and thank you, Elisa. We lost you, but we have you back again.
Sorry. Thank you for picking up, Cindi. I apologize. I don't know what happened.
No worries. Elisa, is there anything else that you want to add before we jump into our conversation?
No, please go on. I appreciate it. Thank you.
So Lydia, I kind of want to rewind and start at the beginning for you, because we've just heard a little bit about your distinguished career, but I know that your mother was an activist for women's rights. And as you have said, she was a feminist before it was fashionable. What made you want to choose journalism as your particular tool for justice?
Well, thank you so much for the International Women Media Foundation, Elisa and Cindi, of course. Thank you so much for having me today. Well, I guess ever since I was a little girl, I kept asking questions. I was nagging everyone in my family, and then in school and everywhere I would go, I would ask questions and try to realize what was going on around me. I always felt like an outsider for some reason. And well, my mom gave me, when I was 13 years old, my mom gave me a small booklet to write. And she said, write all the questions that you have. I guess it was asking me not to keep on asking questions to everyone. And she said, write everything that you see around you and write about your feelings and your thoughts. And then once you're ready, you can come and talk to us. So that's what I did. And now I keep diaries from when I was 13. Now I'm 57. So you can guess that half of my my house is packed with little books that I've been writing my hand, telling my story, little diaries. And then one day when I was 15 or 16 years old, I was talking to my grandfather and asked him how those one chooses her career. I didn't really understand what was going on, because like education, school didn't fit me. I didn't feel like I would really learn how to live life in school. So I was asking him that, and he just, bluntly told me, Lydia, you have to be a writer or a journalist or something like that, because you keep asking questions and you're so worried about reality that you had to really understand it. So maybe that's it. That was the first time I heard about it. And then when I turned 23, I moved to Cancun, and then that's when I decided that I was going to go into cultural journalism and write poetry and the literature. But once I did my first interview with Mayan women, the indigenous women of Cancun, I wouldn't go back ever. I just wrote my first piece on violence against women, and I knew that was it. That was my mission, and then I kept on going.
One of the stories that I heard about your early career during those first years in Cancun was that you were reporting on the proliferation of HIV, and that you went up against a government official who told you that there was no, or there was very little HIV in that area. And you corrected him very publicly and sort of shocked your colleagues by doing that. Can you tell us that story?
Well, yes, it's a funny story now, because it was Mario Villanueva, the governor of Quintana Roo, the state where Cancun and Playa del Carmen and Tulum are. And he's now in jail. And he was incarcerated in the United States for being the first governor linked to organized crime, to the drug cartels in Mexico. And we knew it back then. We were investigating him. We didn't know the scope of organized crime back then, but we knew that he was doing something that had to do with drugs and Colombia and all that. And I was doing my first investigations on that, and I knew he was a bad guy, but I never thought he was such a really like an assassin and a really bad guy. So everybody was afraid of him, because my journalists, my colleagues kept telling me that he had killed his own father. And so when I was investigating HIV/AIDS in Cancun, most of the people that were dying of it were teenagers or young men that were linked to sexual tourism and prostitution, and they were infected by HIV, and some of them were dying outside the hospitals. And once I started covering those stories and doing these pieces on the newspapers, more and more young men came to the newspaper looking for me in person, because back then we didn't have social media. And I was so indignant about it. And I had a radio program back then, so I kept talking openly about it, about the discrimination and the violence against these young men that were left to die outside the hospital, public hospitals in Cancun. So when I published one of my articles in a national newspaper explaining this with my own photographs, so nobody could deny what was happening, we were sleeping. I was married back then, and we were sleeping almost in the middle of the night, and the phone rang, and my husband answered, and a male voice said, I need to talk to Lydia Cacho. This is the governor of Quintana Roo. And my husband thought it was a joke, but he finally gave me the phone, and it was the governor. And he said, listen, I just read the newspaper. It's a national newspaper. He was really angry. And I said, yes. And he said, there's no AIDS in my state. And I said, no, in your state, there might not be AIDS, but in my state, in Quintana Roo, there is. And he said, are you are you aware that you're responding to the governor as if he was like my father or something like that, like a violent father? And I said, yes, I am aware. You're a civil servant. And he said something like, you will have to respond for what you're doing right now. This is not adequate. And then the next day when we woke up and we were going out for a run, there were some armed policemen outside my house. And when I approached them and asked them, they said they were sent by the governor, and they kept following me everywhere for 2 weeks. So then after that, there was a press conference by the governor, and I went there and I asked him about the HIV/AIDS victims. And he said that in his state, there was no AIDS. So I replied again and I said, well, what state do you live in? And everybody was like, oh my God, he's gonna kill you. And then fortunately, he's now in jail. So.
Well, that at least is a story with a happy ending, but it's certainly, I think it's one of the things that I'm sure helped you understand the tremendous risk that you'd be taking when you published Demons of Eden some years later. And, now with, I guess, 17 years hindsight on that book, did you know just how intense the government retaliation to what you were exposing would be? And maybe you can just also tell the audience a little bit about what you did expose.
Yes, well, since 2003, a young girl escaped a network of sex trafficking in Cancun. When she was 13 years old, she was abducted by this businessman, a very rich and very well-known businessman in Cancun society, high society, if you might call it that. And so she escaped and she went to the police, and the police didn't protect her. So she was doing a TV program back then on feminism and women's rights. So she looked for me and we talked, and she told me the story, and I started covering it with other colleagues in local media. And I went into it like deep in an investigation, trying to understand who were doing that, buying the girls, and all the stories that I found out were a lot bigger than what this young girl ever imagined. So when I first investigated the story, I didn't know I was going to publish a book. The only books I had published prior to that were a poetry book and a novel on a woman that had HIV/AIDS. So I went into my TV show with experts, with a psychologist and an expert on domestic violence. And we talked about child pornography for the first time ever in television in Mexico. Nobody thought that child pornography even existed. It was like an strange concept to everyone. So we talked about it, and I mentioned the name of one of the aggressors, the rapists of the girls, and because we had all this evidence by then. And then the next day I was in my office and I received a first call, and he identified himself. He said, I'm Jan Sukarkuri. You talked about me in your TV program, and you're gonna die. You don't know who you're messing with. And I said, yes, I know. And I just hung up. And then he called again, and he said that I was gonna die if I kept on talking about his private life, what he thought it was his private life. So I received 5 death threats before I published the book. One of them included this man that belonged to one of big hotels in Cancun that went to my office. Back then, I already had armed police in my office to protect me from the threats that I had received. And this man came to my office with a big bag, and he said that the senator, Emilio Gamboa, was willing to give me $1 million for the shelter that they knew I really needed if I would shut up and stop talking about them, about the senators and the governors and the businessmen. And I called my guard. It was a woman, and I called her to be witness of what was going on and of the money that this guy had on top of my of my table, working table, and I said, please leave my office and tell the senator I'm not going to take that money, and I'm going to keep on investigating this case. So when the publishers told me that they wanted the book, I had all the investigation, most of it, and I knew that it was dangerous. I knew that there were senators. One of the senators, the one that sent me the money, was one of the runners for president of Mexico. So I knew that I was confronting like the powers that be in Mexico. And then once we published the book, but it wasn't out in the market yet, the National Secretary of Police, that's the name, La Secretaría Nacional de Seguridad, of Security, he called the General Director of Random House in Mexico for a meeting in his office. And when he went there, he was threatened. He told him, for the first time in his life ever as a publisher, international publisher, he never received a threat. And he told him, if you publish the book of Lydia Cacho, you will have to leave the country. And he eventually left the country because he was afraid. But when he came back to the office and he said, Lydia, are you sure? And yes, I said, yes. So when we presented the book that afternoon in a cultural center in Mexico City with other colleagues, the General District Attorney that was fighting organized crime in Mexico sent 20 armed police, heavily armed police, to surround us while we presented the book. And back then I knew I was fighting the state.
I remember that in interviews right after that time, you talked about the desire to create accountability for the people who, after the book came out, not only threatened, but actually illegally jailed and tortured you. And just this past February, I know that there was an arrest of a former governor on charges related to those crimes against you. And I wonder if you can just quickly update us on what is the status of that, and what does the continued fight for justice against those perpetrators look like?
Of course, well, 6 months after I published the book, police car, a car with men dressed as civilians, they came out with guns and they took me from my office. They took me from Cancun to Puebla, 2,000 kilometers away. They tortured me for 20 hours. I didn't know who ordered my kidnapping, that was an illegal arrest. But I suspected there was like political power behind it because it was such a big movement. There were 5 cars, there were 10 policemen, everybody was involved. Nobody was telling me what was going on. And so after the torture, and when I arrived in Puebla and they put me in jail, they threw me in jail. What happened was that the policemen that tortured me kept talking about their boss, like the big boss. And at one time they talked about Kamel Nassif, one of the guys who's already arrested in Lebanon, who's linked to this organized crime ring. And they mentioned the big boss, and the big boss was the governor of Puebla. So when I left jail, somebody told me the governor is the one who ordered your torture and your incarceration. And I couldn't prove it. So 2 months later, these phone calls came out all over the media in Mexico. And the phone calls were taped in which Kamel Nassif was talking to the governor of Puebla, thanking him and offering some bottles of cognac for torturing me, for throwing me in jail. And he was also in another call, he was talking to the director of the local jail in Puebla, laughing together and saying that I was going to be raped inside inside jail, and that I really deserved it for messing with them, with the power. So ever since then, I defended myself in courts, and then when I won, I went after them. And 15 years later, I won in international courts. until the Interpol ordered their arrest. Now, 4 of the police that have tortured me are in jail now. One of them was sentenced 4 days ago to 5 years for torturing me. And the governor is awaiting sentence. We hope that he gets the longest sentence for torture and for trying to stop freedom of expression. And Kamel Nassif is arrested in Lebanon. He will not be extradited to Mexico. So I will be flying to Lebanon to testify against him and try to get him for child pornography, not only for my torture.
Incredible determination. And I'm glad to hear that, albeit 16, 17 years later, that finally you're seeing some justice and that we're seeing some justice. I want to talk a little bit about the situation for journalists in Mexico. At the end of 2020, the Committee to Protect Journalists found that Mexico was actually the most dangerous country in the world for journalists, and had been so for some time. What do you think, if anything, can change that? And also from your personal perspective, when did you decide you needed to leave?
Well, so many of my friends, dear friends and colleagues have been assassinated that every time my phone rings, I'm just afraid that it's bad news. Many of us have learned along the years to understand how death threats work, who's sending these threats and which ones are real or could really bring us to the worst, right? And it has been a long way. When I began investigating the femicides in Ciudad Juarez in 1994, it was a group of female reporters who did it. We began doing that and we received the first death threats back then. And we were really afraid. So I guess that we prepared ourselves for what is going on right now. So if you see the map of threats and assassinations on arrest and torture of journalists in Mexico, you see that a lot of women have been threatened, but not most of the ones that have been assassinated are men. And that is because women got ready for this, for what was coming. We knew there was a vengeance coming back to us because we chose, we had the determination and the professional skills to explain to society how the networks of political powers, from mayors to senators to Congress people and policemen, were linked to the military and to the corrupted officials, hand on hand with organized crime. We began doing that in 1994. So when the war against drugs, so-called war against drugs of President Felipe Calderon began, this kind of violence got really worse for everyone in Mexican society, for regular citizens, but also for the press, because we were the ones calling exactly who was doing what. And we were explaining the gray area in which the government or the state members of state and organized crime were linking together. We made an X-ray of that. And we showed that the military and policemen, not all of them, of course, but the ones that were corrupted, and governors and mayors were the ones ordering the attacks on the press. And they were especially ordering attacks on investigative journalists in different state areas. They were not attacking journalists living in Mexico City. And although I was born in Mexico City, I've always worked in the southeast of Mexico and in different areas, in Sinaloa, in northern Mexico, and Juarez and all that. So they were attacking us outside Mexico City because we were not the powerful journalists. powerful reporters. That's really important, because when people would go to Mexico City and talk to these famous journalists that are sitting at a table, in front of a national TV and being safe and looking great, people go like, well, it's not so dangerous. And then you say, yeah, but if you are down there in the streets documenting reality all over Mexico, then you are in danger. So this is the result of what we've been doing for the last 30 years, which is making journalism one of the tools to explain what's going on in Mexico. Most of the best investigative reporters that we have in Mexico and in Latin America are women. And I'm not saying that because I'm a woman, but because it's a fact. And that has a lot to do with this, that we learned through the years to deal with oppression, with violence, and with networking with other women and other men around the world to be protected and protect each other. And that's why we were so ready for this moment, in which there is a war of members of the Mexican state against the media. The same thing that we see in Honduras, in parts of Brazil, and parts of Colombia and Guatemala. That's what we're saying. They're fighting us because we're telling the truth. We're doing the job that civil servants should be doing, right? So not only defending society and telling the stories that are important to society, and we're also searching for justice for the victims that we of which we tell their stories. And that's not our job. It shouldn't be our job to do this work of a sort of a district attorney, because we're reporters, but we learn to do that. We learn about the law because we're chased by justice, and we know that the victims of forced disappearance, of torture, of threats are also chased and attacked by the justice system in Mexico.
So you're doing the job of public servants. It's incredibly dangerous. And as you said, many of the attacks and threats are gendered. We know that this is a really dangerous time to be a woman journalist in particular. So what do you say, because I'm sure you get this question all the time, to young women who are considering whether they should follow in your footsteps and embrace the career of journalism?
Well, what I say is you have to learn how to live in Mexico. You have to understand if journalism is not only a profession, but it's a mission for you, because that's what it is. We shouldn't be heroes in this work, but we are becoming heroes in a country, in a lawless country, in a country with a huge lack of justice, and the impunity is so high in Mexico that you have to be aware of the knowledge that you have to be a journalist. Not only skills to investigate, ability and ethical power to join the movements, the civil society movements, to understand them, the empathy to interview the victims of any crime or any injustice. You also have to understand the law in Mexico. You have to understand the nuances of the justice system and be aware that you have to belong to bigger networks in which you feel safe, to the networks like the International Women Media Foundation that have saved so many of us in different moments in our lives. You have to be aware that you have to ask for help, the same way that victims ask you for help to be heard. You have to take care of your mental health, of your emotional health, and just, you know, you should know that journalism is one of the noblest and most wonderful professions in the world, for me at least. And that in countries like Mexico, it's a dangerous profession. So just be aware of that. And if you're willing to do it, just be safe.
Well, I have a final question that I want to ask you, but first, before I do, let's go to some of the great questions that have come in the Q&A, and please, to everybody watching, you can pop questions in there. This is a question from Charlotte, who asks, without giving too much away that might endanger yourself, how do you protect yourself from digital threats? We know that online security is such a concern for so many women journalists, and you specifically. How do you deal?
Absolutely. When I started investigating for Demons Vid in 2003, one of the things was child pornography, and we wonder how they shared it, these pedophiles. So I had to learn how to hack. I had a teacher, a very young man, that taught me how to do it in order to get into the dark rooms and all that, to understand them. So since 2003 to 2005, I really studied that, and I learned how to protect myself. So I always use VPN, and I have different phones. My phones, one of my phones, the Mexican one, is tapped right now as we speak, of course. But I have other phones that are safe, with the ones that I talk with the victims, my family, or anyone that will help me and protect me. And then right now I'm living in Spain. I moved 2 years ago when I received an attack in my house, and they killed my dogs. They tried to kill me, so I had to flee Mexico. And I've been living in Spain for 2 years, and the government is protecting me. I'm in constant contact with the state police here in Spain. They are very aware of my case, and also Interpol is aware of my case, and they are aware. They are just searching for the other men that are under that left the country and that are, flying around trying to hide from justice from my case. So I'm very careful. I don't engage in when I enter social media, especially Twitter. I do never engage with violent acts. I don't mind. I don't care how many provocations I receive, how many tweets are writing against me. I never get involved with their network, and that has worked incredibly well for me, because once I just leave them out of my conversation, out of the conversation that I have with 1.5 million people, they don't have the strength to do anything to me. The threats, if they are like serious, I just keep them. I have a screenshot. I try to follow up who it is that is sending me the death threats, and I just send them to the police if I think that they are serious.
There's another question about the situation for journalists in Mexico right now. Question is, what do you think about the current situation at Notimex, the Mexican news agency?
Well, I think it's just such a great shame that a great investigative reporter like San Juana Martinez has become a civil servant, and she just lost her ethical, I don't know, view of life. It's, I don't know, it's so disappointing. When she joined Notimex, she kept saying there was corruption within the news agency. I'm sure there was, I don't doubt that, because Mexico is quite corrupted. But the way she handled things, she violated human rights of workers in Notimex. She manipulated some of the journalists in order to put pressure on them from this state news agency to attack other journalists and people in general that were denouncing the illegal activities of the agency. And she just asked the president of Mexico to protect her, and she's just suing right now. She's legally suing Article 19, the only organization in Mexico that is protecting and defending journalists in our country. So it's just shameful that she just incarnated that kind of power that she's been fighting for so many years. For more than 20 years, she was a brave journalist, and now she's a civil servant, and she joined the club of the corrupted. And I'm just sad because she was a good friend of mine.
Thank you. Another question, you mentioned the need to address mental health amongst journalists on the front lines of investigative reporting, which of course is something that used to be considered trivial to talk about. I've heard you talk a bit about yoga and meditation and how that's been an important tool for you. The question asks, how are you able to protect your mental health and well-being in the face of constant threats and trauma?
Well, the first trauma of my life was given to me by my mother, who was a psychologist, because she was a feminist, she was a psychologist, and she would take me as a little girl to the poorest areas in Mexico, where she would work with women, and she would ask me to stay with the kids and work and play with them while she worked with the women. And she said, you have to do this because you have to understand that the only way that women can learn different things in this condition of poverty, extreme poverty, is by having someone taking care of the kids. So you have to understand that you have privilege because you are a kid that can go to school. So after years and years of asking questions, when I was 10 years old, I asked my mom, why are these kids that are my age so poor and this and that? And my mom said, you have to ask that to yourself and try to understand what you will do for them. And then I remember one day I was so angry and crying and, and I say, Mom, I'm just a little girl. There's nothing I can do for them, And she said, yeah, but you have to understand that you have to be so strong that one day you will do something for the kids that are not privileged like you. So I kept telling her along the years, because she was a psychologist and she was doing therapy with her clients. And I always said, I really need therapy to heal my wounds from your education. And she said, you do. So I began going to therapy when I was 18, and I've never stopped since. I always do therapy. Right now that I'm in exile, I've been doing it like twice a week. I started doing yoga 30 years ago. And that for me was a life-changing moment, because yoga wasn't what it is right now. It wasn't about contortion and beauty and all this. Yoga is about knowing, getting to know yourself, reading the stress in your body and your mind, learning how to cope with anxiety, with fear, with sadness. And I do yoga everywhere I go, every morning, at least half an hour, but I try to do it 1 hour a day. And that has really been really important to me. I remember when I went to the first training for journalists in the US, it was with a group of journalists, very famous war journalists. I was the only Mexican reporter there, was not known to anyone. And they were teaching us how to be safe in war zones, because I was planning to go to Afghanistan and I was a freelancer. So when we finished the workshop, I asked the teacher, I said, everything that I learned is amazing, but how do you cope with mental health? I mean, all these that you're dealing with, I mean, the stories are just, horrific. And then one of those very famous New York Times war reporter looked at me and he said, we drink, Lydia, we drink. That's what you should do. And I remember I thought, oh my God, I love tequila, I love beer, but I'm never gonna drink to cope with war crimes or with my sadness. So I learned from the worst to do the best. And that's what I teach in my workshops. If you're really sad or if you're full of anguish, don't drink. Go dance, look for friends, have a good meal, do yoga, go, I don't know, walk, take a nice walk, have a dog. Dogs are fantastic to as a therapy companion. So yeah, I think that well-being is so important for everyone, and especially when you do this kind of work. Otherwise you toughen up, and when you toughen up, you lose your empathy to work with victims.
I love the idea of adding dance and dogs and therapy and yoga to the official J School curriculum from now on. There's one more question from the listener chat, and it's actually the same question that I wanted to ask you to wrap up, which is what's next for you? I mean, you mentioned some of the work that you have upcoming around justice in the cases that we talked about, and you're going to be going to Lebanon for those legal proceedings. Journalistically, what are you reporting on now, and what are the stories that you're interested in telling next?
Well, right now I'm finishing a book that I will give to my publisher once we finish this, hopefully tonight. And it's a book of my diaries and letters that I've been writing with friends, and friends have written to me for 30 years more. And it's sort of a strange biography that tells the story of a journalist, but from the voices, a choral book in which we have the voices of a lot of people. But I also have part of my diaries from when I was 13 and 14 years old. So it's a fun book. It's interesting, and I've loved writing it. And now I'm working on another book. I'm beginning working on another book. It's an investigation of how teenagers in Spain are understanding or living within feminism and their human rights and sexuality and everything. That's really exciting. And I have to go back to Syria soon to finish a book on young girls and boys that are being forced to be part of war, of different violent groups in Syria and the area around it.
Okay, well, you've told us that you need to turn your manuscript into your publisher, and we don't want to be standing between the journals of Lydia Cacho and its publication. So I know we need to get you back to that. But Lydia, thank you so much. Thank you for your journalism. Thank you for your courage. And thank you for being here and sharing both of those things with us today.
Thank you, Cindi. Thank you, Elisa, and all the team that made this possible. It was great to talk to you, and hopefully one day I will do it again from Mexico.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you both so much for joining us. It's incredible to hear your stories, and you've been at this for so long. And I just want to point out to people that this isn't a one-time event that journalists live with. It's really turns into their life's work, lived under duress. And so we applaud you for all of your hard work, Lydia, and we're here to support you in anything that you need. Thank you, Cindi. We so appreciate you being part of our family, and good luck to both of you, and keep in touch, Lydia.
Thank you so much. I will. Thank you.
Thanks everybody for joining us. We'll have another conversation in July, and we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.